Hi class. Well, this assignment seems to cause a lot of confusion with students, so I thought I would just start by going through the book real quickly and showing you some of the examples from the book and describing, how a little more in depth how we're seeing space being used or the illusion of space. Now, here's a very quick, obvious example that is just a straight photograph. And you can argue that, well, if you take a photograph and it's done accurately, it's going to automatically show a sense of space. Yes and no. It depends on the artist or the photographer's choice of time of day that they photograph, choice of angle of view with their lens, and compositional arrangement. All of these decisions are what increase the sense of space. Now, I would say that the single greatest thing showing a sense of space in this photograph is contrast. And what do I mean? Foreground. Look at the shadow here and the light there. That's pretty high contrast. The light is pretty light, the shadow is pretty dark. But look at the next hill. Shadow's not quite as dark, the light's maybe not quite as light. And look as we move back all the way to this one. Look at the difference between the shadow and the light. Not very much difference. And then look back here. Oh my goodness. It's almost all the same value. So that's a big change in value relationships between the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. And the underlying principle is atmospheric perspective. The atmosphere is greater at this distance. You're looking through the atmosphere, and the particles in the atmosphere are causing this sort of haze that makes everything lower in contrast. It's a very important concept, atmospheric perspective. And again, it's a choice that the artist or photographer makes in this case. Okay, and there's other things going on here, but I'm going to continue to some other examples. Okay, here's another one of my favorites here. Let's make this so we can see it all in there. Oops, there we go. By Ando Hiroshige, one of my favorites. In this case, now you see diminishing size, right? The bigger fish versus the smaller fish. The bigger fish is closer. But also look at the textural detail. A lot of textural detail in these scales, but you don't see them at the ones that are farther away, naturally, because they're farther away. Okay, so there's an example. And again, there's other things going on here like overlapping. Not vertical placement, though, because actually they're going the wrong way. Should be going further up, but it's because we're up high looking down. So keep in mind, not all of these things are being used simultaneously. Let's keep going here. Well, here's a really good example where there is very little sense of space. It's purposely very flattened. Now, what do we have here? Well, we do have a sense of volume. How do we have a sense of volume? These boxes and shapes are all showing linear perspective. Linear perspective, not atmospheric perspective. It's maybe what we call isometric perspective, meaning it's not true linear perspective, because the parallel lines are not converging to the same vanishing point. So it's kind of an unrealistic sense of perspective, but it is still nonetheless referring to linear perspective, done purposely. The only other thing would be vertical placement. The figures are pretty much the same size, and there you can tell that, I mean, this one doesn't look like it's really that much further behind this one, the figure here, but in fact, he is, because he's higher up on the picture plane. So basically, you only have two really clear uses of space and volume in this. Texture, look at the texture back here versus the texture up here. The same, so it's not increasing the sense of space. Okay, there's a pretty good example, but I want to skip ahead. Again, a very flat design. Again, vertical placement being the only real sense of space we have here. Even perspective is gone, because this plaid grid should actually be in linear perspective if it was showing a real deep sense of space. Okay, let's keep... this is the one I was looking for, Ansel Adams. Okay, now you have it all going on here. Well, not all, but some very important use of atmospheric perspective. Look at the contrast in the foreground versus the middle ground, and each mountain a little further away, lower in contrast, more grayed out. That's clear atmospheric perspective. Okay? Also in this one. And here you also have the color blue being added to increase the sense of atmospheric perspective. But again, we're not so much concerned with color at this point, but I should point it out because it is an important part of atmospheric perspective. Okay, so how are we showing volume in this painting here by Rockwell Kent? We've talked a lot about space, and we could talk about, the textural details of these plants and trees and how as we move further back, they get lower and less. That's the definition, which of course has to do with atmospheric perspective, as well as the contrast. Certainly it's very high contrast here, and as you move back, it's very low contrast. Uh, and of course, vertical placement, diminishing size, all overlapping, all of those things are working in this painting. But what about volume? Well, that really gets back to chiaroscuro and from the previous chapter about value, chapter 12. And we could go and look and review that, which maybe you should do on your own if you're not entirely sure about it. But chiaroscuro refers to the way the artist shows light and shadow, or a dark side and a light side, to identify a light source. And we know that something's three-dimensional when light moves around it differently. In other words, you can see the sunlight on one side of it and then the shadow on the other side of it, which tells us that this is a three-dimensional shape, which has mass or volume, depending on how you define it. And you can see it, at different levels of, back into the design as well. Even way, way back here, there's still a light side and a dark side, which gives us the illusion of volume in these little trees way, way back here. And less so on the mountains themselves, because as you can tell from one side to the other, there isn't a lot of change. That doesn't mean that there isn't volume here. It's just not accentuated at this distance, whereas the close-up things, you can definitely see it very clearly identified. So we could also skip through and find, as you can see here, it says see also value in space, page 250, and if I click on that, it'll take us here to that description about chiaroscuro, which is really what we're talking about. And here's a good example of a drawing that has a really strong sense of volume. Not a very good strong sense of space. We could, talk about that as well, but you really don't have a good sense of space. You do have a good sense of form and volume. You can really tell that this arm and the entire figure is, three-dimensional because of the subtle use of light. A little bit of shadow on this side and a darker shadow on this side gives us a clear sense of the light source. Again, so you can go through more of these examples, and one thing to do is look up some of these artists if you want to get some examples. But certainly don't feel limited to this. As I said before, I would suggest looking at some examples of the Renaissance, for example, and also maybe some abstract ones. And I'm actually going to pull up an abstract artist here to talk about, so you can see how a non-objective painting can still have a sense of space. Okay, so here's an example by an artist named Al Held, and this is a non-objective painting, purely abstract, and yet it has a pretty deep sense of space. So how is that done? Well, obviously you can see overlap. You might say diminishing scale or size of some of the thickness of these sort of swirling abstract shapes. Certainly linear perspective, but also look at how the contrast of those colors up close is much brighter, much more contrasting, the dark versus the light. Whereas as you move further back here, look at this here, very lower, a lot lower in contrast, lighter colors, and of course the background is totally white. So you can really see that he's using all of those atmospheric perspective things. Now, not really any change in detail. Everything is very hard-edged, so you don't have any sort of blurriness or loss of focus. And there is no texture being used, but all those other principles are being used pretty well in this example. So hopefully this shows you that these various devices can be used in a variety of paintings. And for the last example, let me just see if I can find another one here. Favorite example, but I think it's a work of art we're all familiar with, and this shows volume and illusion of space very well. Atmospheric perspective, detail and texture up close is very, very clear, whereas in the distance it's very vague, which makes it that use of definition. Chiaroscuro used for volume, all those things you would expect in a Renaissance painting that show a sense of deep sense of space.